And look at this here. Let's read this verse 1 of chapter 17. It says, "Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Sokah, which belongs to Judah, and they camped between Sokah and Ezekiel," whatever that word is, I can't pronounce it. "And Saul and his men of Israel were gathered and camped in the valley of Elah. They drew up battle array to encounter the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, which Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with the valley between them. And then a champion came out from the armies of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was, it says, 6 cubits and a span, which is over 9 feet tall. And he had a bronze helmet on his head. He was clothed with scale armor, which weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he also had bronze glaives on his legs, and a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. And the shaft of the spear was like a weaver's beam, and the head of the spear weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield carrier also walked before him." Now, when you read these things, you kind of think, okay, well, this is great. You're giving me all these facts, but what does this mean? I want to point some things out to you. What's amazing here, the Bible always proves itself to be God-inspired by the little things that you read here. And you could read that and go, well, how does that really say something? Well, first of all, I want to point something out to you. You notice that his armor and his weapons are all made of bronze. You know, if the Bible was just written by some guy later on in time, that's an error that somebody could have made, because they could have said that he had an iron shield or an iron sword. This wasn't the Iron Age. This was the Bronze Age. This period of time when this is going on, there wasn't that type of technology. Bronze was the cutting edge thing, you know. The other thing is his armor, and all these things match exactly what archaeology has proven for warriors to wear during that period of time. I think that's just amazing. It's an amazing little fact you can just read past. I mean, here you go. And another interesting thing is, for the longest of time, people believed that this story of David and Goliath was just a myth, you know, to try to push David up to be this great king, and somebody made it up. And some people believe it was written long after David even existed, and they copied it from a Greek story in the Iliad about a guy defeating a giant. And they said, and that's always been held by skeptics to say, well, that's really the story. But the interesting thing is you'll find out that as archaeologists start to find different things and they search out, archaeology always proves the Bible. It never disproves it. It always proves it. And they found this piece of this area that came to find out was the historical Gath in Philistine. And they found some broken pottery. They call them parchments, like pieces of old pottery, that had a name that basically matched the name of Goliath. And that there was this great warrior during that time named Goliath, which would have been like the 10th century, which would have been 400 years before even these Greek writings would have even came about. So you find out actually it was the Greeks that were copying the Israelites, not the other way around. So this story, at first people said, it's not true. Well, then they start finding archaeology. They realize, well, hey, there's some truthfulness to this story. There's something here, So you've got this man, this huge, tall guy with this giant, and the armor matches exactly what a warrior would have looked like during that times. He had a scale armor. This guy was a serious warrior. He had this huge, heavy armor on. And he comes out, and he has a shield, and I think it's interesting that he's so big, and he has so much armor that he has to have somebody standing in front of him holding his shield, because he can't hold it himself. He has so much stuff. And he stands in the middle, and I like how he says this in verse 8. He stood and shouted at the ranks of Israel and said, Why do you come out and draw in battle array? Am I not of the Philistines, and you are of your servant Saul? Choose a man for yourself and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will become your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you will become our servants and serve us. And again the Philistines said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. And when Saul and all of Israel heard the words of the Philistines, look at what it says. They were dismayed and greatly afraid. It's one of those things that when I read this, I catch little word plays like that. And I've read the whole Bible, so I go, oh yeah, that sounds familiar. Well, does that sound familiar to anybody else, being afraid and greatly dismayed? Back in Joshua, chapter 1, when God told that Joshua was going to go out and they were going to take the promised land, he said, do not be afraid and do not be dismayed. That was one of the things that God spoke to. It said, because God is with you, you don't have to be afraid. You don't have to be dismayed. God's going to be with you. But here we go. Back then, when Joshua was doing this, they were killing multiple giants, not just one. It said when the spies went out and they spied out the promised land, they saw that the land was full of giants. Now, you've got the whole army of Israel, and they're standing up to one giant. And they're afraid of one giant. Keep your finger here, and I'm going to show you the scripture in Leviticus. This is pretty interesting. Keep your finger here. Turn over to Leviticus. Leviticus is, you'd say the first, second, third book in the Bible. Leviticus 23. Some of Moses' writings. Look at what he says here, and I think this is pretty interesting. Leviticus 23. Let's go to... I'm sorry, Leviticus 26. I write so ugly I can't even tell what my writing says sometimes. Okay, Leviticus 26, verse 3. Says, if you will walk in my statutes, and you will keep my commandments, so as to carry them out, and then I shall give you rain in season on your land, yielded produce, and the trees, and they'll bear fruit. And he goes in, all these great things are going to happen. But look at then down here to verse 6. It says, and I shall also grant peace in the land, so that you may lie down with no one making you tremble. I shall also eliminate harmful beasts from your land, and no sword will pass through your land. But you will chase your enemies, and they will fall before you by your sword. 5 of you will chase 100, and 100 of you will chase 10,000, and your enemies will fall before you by your sword. Now go ahead and turn back to 1 Samuel. Do you hear? God had already promised, said, look, 5 of you will chase away 100. 100 of you will chase away 10,000. He said, because I'm with you. They're going to fall by your sword. You know, it's amazing as you read into the stories of David and you see these mighty men that David had with him. They were men that believed this. The story of the one man that stood and fought for that, piece of ground that was a lentil field. One guy killed off 1,000 people because he stood his ground. Now you say, well, these guys just must have been mighty warriors. No, they believed God. They believed the covenant. So here you've got Israel, because they're led by Saul, a man who's not following God. And the amazing thing in this whole story is, what does Goliath want? He wants Saul. He's saying, bring out a man that I might fight him. It already said, Saul was, it said head and shoulders above all the other people in Israel. That would have meant Saul was probably at least pushing 6'9", 7 foot tall. Saul was a big man. He wasn't some little guy. And so Saul was their king, their mighty warrior, and he's out there sitting in his tent saying, so who's going to go out there and fight this guy? Because he's afraid. And it's interesting, that Goliath, when he's taunting them, and this is something I was reading in Hebrew, it's more historical. Basically, you've got the original writings, where you've got the original text of the Old Testament. Well, back in the day, just like we do today, we have concordances or commentaries that people write about the scriptures. Well, back then, rabbis used to write their little commentary, and they actually writing a commentary on this. This is from back, out of the Talmud, which is really old. Said that they believed that Goliath was part of the army that originally took the ark. Now, and that story is in the beginning part of Samuel, when Samuel's a lot younger. Actually, I think he's a kid, and the ark is taken from the armies of God by the Philistines. And that was when he takes it to the temple Dagon, and that whole thing happens. You read that in the beginning part of Samuel. Well, a lot of these Jewish historians believe that Goliath was part of that army that took the ark. So when he stood up to defy Israel, he was like, look, you guys had your ark which represented your God. Well, I was part of the army that defeated you guys and took your ark. So who are you? I'm not afraid of you. And then when it says he defied the ranks of Israel and defied their God, he knew that, hey, I defeated your God once before. What makes you think he's going to help you now? That was the way that Goliath was looking at this. Look at verse 12 now. Now David was a son of an Ephraimite of Bethlehem in Judea, whose name was Jesse. He had 8 sons. And Jesse was old in the days of Saul, advanced in years among men. And it says his 3 older sons had gone off to battle with Saul. And the names of his 3 sons that went out to battle were Elib, Adamid, and Shammah. And David was the youngest. Now the 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's flock at Bethlehem. And the Philistines came forward morning and evening for 40 days and took their stand. Then Jesse said to David his son, take now for your brothers an ephah of roasted grain and 10 loaves, and run to the camp to your brothers. And bring also 10 cuts of cheese and all this kind of stuff. He's saying, bring all this stuff to take care of your brothers and feed them.